A good Erev Shabbos. Jacob lived. Vayechi Yaakov is the beginning of our parsha this week. And yet, when we encounter Yaakov, he is an old man, already preparing to meet his death. It recalls some weeks ago in Parshas Chaye Sarah, another parsha titled The Life of Sarah. The second verse, very second verse of that parsha, tells us, Vatama Sarya b'Kiryat Arba hi Chevron. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, also known as Chevron. It's certainly an open invitation to think more broadly about the meaning of life and what is important and when. Vayechi Yaakov is a description of Jacob's last years and days in this world, and his making it abundantly clear to his children how he wished to be mourned and what blessings he gave each of them individually to pursue and achieve their own individual destinies. Perhaps those are important facets of the meaning of life as well. Let's explore a few points of Yaakov's last days in order to let that event in Jewish history, the passing of our last patriarch, inform our own lives. Yaakov says, Al nasig breni b'Mitzrayim, please do not bury me in Egypt. Rather, he says, Unasasani b'Mitzrayim ukvartani b'kvurasam. Take me out of Egypt and bury me in their tomb with my father, my grandfather, my family. Then he asks his son Yosef to bring his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to him so that he can bless them. Kachem na elai v'avarachem. This is the idea of blessing the future generations, letting them know what's important, what you hope and expect from the future of the family, and what their part is in all that. And with his last breaths, Yaakov calls Ma'aras HaMachpelah Mikne Hasadeh, purchase of the field, reminding all who are in earshot that Avraham bought this burial place from Ephron, the Hittite, years before. This is clearly a biblical proof for funeral pre-planning. If Avraham bought a place for himself and his wife Sarah and sufficient space for his son and grandson and their spouses, surely that's an inspiration to us to plan ahead for our own demise and make sure that our wishes are looked after. What's the deeper meaning behind the request, Al nasig breni b'Mitzrayim, please don't bury me in Egypt? Why not? If it was a good enough place to live in, and some say that the name of the parsha, Vayechi, suggests that Yaakov not only lived, but lived the best years of his life, the last 17 years, in Egypt, surrounded by all of his children, grandchildren. If it's good enough to live in, why isn't it good enough to be buried in? The eternal wish of a Jew is life in Israel. I shall walk before the Lord in the lands of the living, says Psalm 116. Not only this life, but in the life of the world to come also. We anticipate that the resurrection will come first to those who are buried in the land of Israel. That's the reason when we're buried anywhere on earth, in Toronto or Tashkent or Tangier or Trumpsburg, we're all buried with a little bit of earth, a little sprinkling of dust from the land of Israel. Every Jew wants to be the first in line, so all those buried with or amidst the dust of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, are ensuring our place at the front of the line in the time of resurrection, Olam Atchia, as we learned together a few years back in Tractate Sanhedrin. Until such time as that happens, the proper way for a Jew to be buried is Kever Yisrael, which really means being buried among Jews. That's why it was so important for the Landsmannschaften and the Shuls, since forever, to secure burial ground for their members, to ensure proper and dignified burial in keeping with Jewish law. Yaakov also asked that his body be taken and buried in Ma'aras HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah at Hebron, meaning what we might call intact burial. We bury the entire body as is. Why did they go to all this trouble to bury in Ma'aras HaMachpelah, in the cave of Machpelah? Why not cremate? Smaller carbon footprint, all the environmental arguments we hear nowadays. You could mail him in an envelope back to Hebron. Why schlep? Absolutely not. I heard about someone, not here, but in the U.S. somewhere, who wanted to be cremated, God forbid, in solidarity with all his family who perished in the Shoah. Well-intentioned, but 100% foolish. I hope his rabbi told him how foolish that was. If you could ask the souls of each and every one of those family members who perished in the Holocaust, wouldn't you want a proper Jewish burial with honor, with respect, kavod, dignity, with kaddish, lovingly brought by the Chevra Kadisha to your final rest? Don't you think they all would have wanted that? The reason the enemies cremated us in ovens was because they knew we would see it as a bizayon, the worst degradation of a Jewish body that they or we could think of. No. Cremation says there's no holiness to the physical, the body is worthless, everything that flies in the face of all that we believe. Intact body of the whole body is the expression of Jewish law and tradition. This Shabbos, some 550 or more shuls around the world, in North America, the UK, Australia, are focusing on end-of-life issues at the request of the National Association of Chevra Kadisha. While we can all take comfort in the knowledge that the cemeteries and funeral homes of the Jewish community of Toronto are in responsible hands, it still makes a lot of sense for us to speak periodically about end-of-life issues because it's not easy to discuss, and these are very important, quite literally, life or death concerns. So one thing to note of interest is that in the past few years, Kehillat Shari Torah has formed its own Chevra Kadisha, while in other Kehillas, the Chevra Kadisha, the Holy Society as it's called, actually does the work of preparing the dead for burial by washing and dressing them in accordance with halacha. Our Chevra Kadisha decided to leave that responsibility with the funeral chapels and instead turn our attention toward making information available and accessible to our members, in addition to supporting our members at the time of grief. As a result, our sharetorah.com website has a downloadable, printable booklet on the Resources tab, which you can read at your leisure, all about end-of-life concerns. We also have printed copies for you to take at Shul, and if you can't make it to Shul now and you'd like to have it mailed to you, please let us know and we will. To highlight a few of the topics that are covered there, one of them is pre-planning, which is emphasized really throughout this parsha. As we discussed, Yaakov says to Yosef, promise me, even swear to me, that you will not bury me here in Egypt. I want to be buried with my ancestors in Hebron, where Avraham and Yitzchak and their wives are buried, and according to tradition, Adam and Chava. Yaakov makes it clear what he wants and inspires us to make our wishes known in a similar fashion. It's very important to have this conversation with kids, with friends, with executors, with lawyers, whoever will look after things when our time is over, to make sure that our wishes are carried out appropriately. Now the question is, what should our wishes be? I've had this conversation with a number of people in the Kehillah, and I'll tell you, we both feel better after the talk because we come away with clarity, understanding, and definite expression, often on paper, of what's to be done. Letting you know that I'm ready and willing to help anyone think through these things. Please be in touch anytime, here at your service. There is one end-of-life issue that we do have to keep confronting, which becomes more challenging all the time. That is what's nicely called medical assistance or medical aid in dying. That's not what I call it. I have a simpler name for it. Not going to use it now. I got in trouble, but you can probably figure out what I call it. Please call me if you don't know what I'm talking about. Causing someone to die is causing someone to die, even if you mean well, even if you're a doctor, even if they ask for it, even if you really think it's a favor. We are forbidden to do such a thing. It can't be any simpler than that. We cannot do anything to speed up someone dying for any reason. We cannot take someone's life from them, not an hour of it, not a minute of it. Let's talk about what we can do, because people do have a fear of the unknown, particularly terminal illness, particularly the pain that may accompany illness toward the end of life. Probably 30 years ago, I heard a doctor say on the radio in an interview, it made a real impression. He said, a good doctor never says there's nothing more I can do. There is always something that can be done. If not by you, then find someone else to manage pain and discomfort, to assuage the suffering, to listen to what the person is going through, be there with them in time of physical and mental anguish. There's always something that can be done for the dying patient. Certainly not giving up on them and turning your back if you can't reverse the condition. We all die. And we today have the blessing to live in a time where pain and even consciousness can be medically managed so the person doesn't experience such pain as the end of life nears, at least as far as we're able to discern. All this is part of the pre-planning, which we learned before from not only Yaakov's example, but even Avram's example of securing a fitting resting place for his family. Now is the time to have these talks. Commit them to writing. Make sure the decision makers in our family or our circle of friends has them so that our wishes are clear at the time that they become relevant. This is just a quick survey of the issues involved. There are more, and really it's worth it for each and every one of us, once a year, to check our documents and our plans and keep them up to date. And there's no time like the present. On somewhat of a different note, this Shabbat morning we'll have a very special event just before our minyan begins. Even as we've been talking about end-of-life concerns, Torah remains Torah's Chaim, the Torah of life. It inspires and illuminates and guides our days, day by day, moment by moment. The Torah itself was given on Shabbat morning. On Shabbos morning, the Gemara in Tractate Shabbat tells us that that year, 2448, the 6th of Sivan, Shavuot, occurred on Shabbos morning. This Shabbos morning of our year, 5782, in Shul, we will receive a Torah anew, a new Sefer Torah dedicated to Kehillat Shari Torah. If you haven't signed up for Shabbos morning yet, and there are still spaces, please sign up and join us for this very special event as we welcome a newly commissioned, newly written Sefer Torah into our community. We'll begin the Hachnasa Sefer Torah, the procession into the Shul up to the Ark, to install, as it were, the new Sefer Torah, and then we will begin our Shabbos morning davening as we have in recent months at 10 a.m. Please join us. May God, who is the source of life, continue to bless us all with long life and happiness and good health. Shabbat Shalom.